Thank you, Thomas. And I need to respond to little threat earlier about Singapore, be careful. Well, anyway, thanks for the democratic space in our northern province. I'm able to stand here. and the privilege of having a meeting here in Johor should not be taken lightly, because what Thomas said was indeed true of their experiences in the past regarding finding public spaces in Johor Bahru to hold forums of this nature, even on matters relating to Malaysia. And I like to differ with PJ's view that he does not want to see Singapore doing Malaysia. I disagree only from the perspective of what do we mean by doing a Malaysia. For him, it's and no doubt better to do things in the best way possible in our Singapore way. There is no dispute, and no one in the right mind could dispute that Malaysia has created a miracle not only relevant actually to Malaysians, but to countries in the rest of Southeast Asia, where they could see hope that it is possible to effect change through the ballot box. You have Philippines that try out people's power and they lost. Now, Hisham mentioned about defending the democratic space, and that precisely, as far as is it working? Yeah. That as far as Malaysia is concerned is their most current responsibility for activists and also their most important mission at the moment. In other countries, places like Burma, places like Cambodia, where the election was recently stopped by Hun Sen, in places like Burma, where you have the military still having effective control over Aung San Suu Kyi, and in Thailand, where election was promised but still not delivered. Now, that is the essence of the Malaysian experience, and we don't want a time when people had to contemplate effecting change through the barrel of the gun. That was tried and failed as well, not just in Malaysia, but also in Thailand and other parts of the region. It begs the question of, before answering the issue of can Singapore do a Malaysia, it's most Singaporeans, probably, I say most, those in this room, majority of Singaporeans would love to see the possibility of a change in Singapore in the same manner that we have or they have achieved in Malaysia. But my first question is the issues which are raised by Singaporeans. Many of them, why do we need to do a Malaysia where, as far as they are concerned, everything works? Everything not just seems to work, and everything works. And the problem with activists and those who want to have more democratic space have failed to explain what is the alternative that we want for Singapore. PJ quite rightly raised the point that the strength of the PAP's argument is that they have sold the idea that they are the most competent and in terms of performance that they are able to deliver. This is not just a rhetoric of the PAP. This is what manifestly true to many voters, even for those who are the poorest, and even for those who are critical. And that is the problem faced by those seeking an alternative way of running the country with more democratic space. Hence, what we see on social media in terms of any critique of Singapore is the most current one was the former Prime Minister talking about earning 500,000 is just mediocre. In order to be of any good, you ought to be earning over $1 million. And that starts a whole debate about the question of elites being overpaid. And that is the type of responses that we have at the very most in the level of being critical of the government. Okay, of course, the latest concern is about the future of people who bought public housing and so on. And again, the question is what happened to them? It would not be difficult for, I know at the moment it is difficult for the PAP to search for a solution, but miraculously, I'm quite sure by the time of the next election, a solution could be found. Expensive it might be, they could extend it by another 10 years for those who are just facing another 30 years to go. And if you think of it, if every 5 years when the election comes, they extend the leasehold of HDB, then they can be in power perpetually because you will satisfy 85% of the population who are in housing board. And if we argue just within that limited parameters of the current issues, then there probably is very little chance of Singapore being able to do Malaysia. And my point is that why do we have such great difficulty in defining an alternative? And I feel that the alternatives are there. If you see behind this room, there are some, there is a wall, yellow, printed in yellow with the People's Charter for Southeast Asia. This is something quite new which I'm involved with together with Hisham and with many other social activists and exiles in the Southeast Asian region. I feel in the case of Singapore, we are unable to argue that economy should be in the service of the people. Instead of, at the moment, the people are the slaves of the economic system. And I use the word slave or serve in a strong term. But that is by no means not emotional, in that effectively, if you read through, or if you go through the narrative of Singapore, the argument since the days in the 1960s, I still remember when in 1973, when we were responding to the recession at the time when I was at the Student Union and also chairman of the Retrenchment Research Center. You have people like David Nair, his famous book published at about that time, Not by Wages Alone, and we are talking about, well, as a nation, people should tighten their belts. That was the start of the industrial revolution, the industrialization process. People had tightened their belts. And after a few decades, now what is the new argument? The new argument is that, well, the government owes you nothing, and if you happen to be poor and so on, probably your children should help to look after you. Now, that for me is an example that form of argument is an example of people are always in the service of the economy instead of the other way around, that the economy should serve the need of the people. The question of leasehold property is the same example. Not that the government did not know that. As a lawyer, I know the meaning of leasehold. I know that by the time 90 years is up, 99 years is up, you own zero. But yet, not long ago, the people were promised that, well, you still have a house to sell. You still have a property to sell to support yourself in old age. That is a myth. And reminding oneself that 85% of the population lives in public housing. If those who want change are creative enough, we should be able to formulate an argument to get the support of 85% of residents who are in public housing. Now, the other point is about democracy. We all know that there is a rule by law rather than rule of law. And why is that so? Because the entire Constitution has been hijacked. The Constitution and the law are all for the service of the state. So for Singapore, it argues on the sovereignty of the state. Shall we not ideologically turn the argument that what we want is sovereignty of the people instead of just sovereignty of the state? Why is it not possible for us to sell the idea that it is important to defend the sovereignty of the individual rather than the state? And as a lawyer, every day of my work, I've been doing letters, arguments, and so on, based on respect. Article 8 of the Constitution, European Constitution, is the same wording as the Singapore Constitution in terms of the state needs to respect the rights of the individual. The state needs to respect the rights of family life. And yet, in the Singapore context, that piece of constitution has been interpreted in a way that it is, regardless of the constitution, is a prerogative of the state to limit those rights. Now, some may argue that, well, these are Western ideas of no relevance to people in Asian societies, Asian values and so on, which in my view, the term Asian values are used in such a manner that it does not reflect the reality of the 21st century. And it is in that context that I would say when we talk about doing a Malaysia, firstly is we have to be convinced that we are able to provide an alternative way of looking at how Singapore society ought to be. Some people feel sorry for me that although I'm born in Singapore, they have deprived me of my citizenship. Thank you very much for those concerns. But I feel sorry for Singaporeans here. Well, because you have not realized that you have lost the country. Now, Singapore, someone just told me a few days ago that Lee Kuan Yew, for how many years when Marina Sands was under construction, he was always going to somewhere, a cafe at Fullerton Square, where he could see the constructions, and it's something which he was very proud of. You have forgotten that the symbol of Singapore very soon be replaced by Marina Sands. And what's wrong with it? Now, we have not paused to think that what is the essence of a country. When you have people like Liu Taiker talking about, well, we can cope with a population of 10 million. You have architects who think that it's okay to have vertical cities and so on. But you have not paused to think what type of a society you want to end up in, where populations have to live in such a small space and the impact of it. Why a country like Norway would choose to control its population to 4 million. A McDonald's worker in Norway is paid 24 to 27 euros per hour, 3 times or 2.5 times more in London. What is the impact of that? The impact of that is that more Norwegians are more willing to work in McDonald's. You don't have a situation where you need to take in more migrants. And this is not being xenophobic when I raise this question of how big a Singapore population ought to be. Because in any society, you need to calibrate the percentage between the locals and the new citizens. Otherwise, the character of the society that you want may change beyond recognition. These have electoral consequences, and especially if you have a society where your new citizens are there just for the passport, then you should be concerned about your future. I myself deal with many new migrants in England. Through my work, I help a lot to a lot of Chinese nationals and people from elsewhere to take up citizenship after 4 years or 6 years in England. I understand the new migrant mindsets. They are here today, they go elsewhere tomorrow. They are mercenaries, and in fact, someone that I helped came back to me to want to denounce his British citizenship now. Why? Because he could get a piece of land in China if he continued to keep his Chinese citizenship. So there are these issues that one has to consider. Now, for me, what it's meant by doing a Malaysia is not just a change of government or not just getting an ex-prime minister to head a campaign. Malaysia achieved what they did, not because of Dr. Mahathir. It started many years ago with the Reformasi movement and then Bersih. Malaysia would not be today without the NGOs. Malaysia would not be today if their politicians are unwilling to collaborate with NGOs. Singapore, we have a very different scenario. We have A, very few NGOs, and B, if there are NGOs, they don't want to deal with political issues other than the very narrow remit of their work. If you are in Singapore, even an opposition party was shunned away from attending meeting of this nature. Here we have Hassan Karim, who quite happily, and he is a government party MP, willing to share a platform with someone like Hisham. Now, that is the difference in the mindset of the Malaysian people and their political parties. And this is where, in the case of Malaysia, they have a unity of purpose, not just among NGOs, but with the opposition parties at the time as well. And that, for me, is one of the important ingredients which is lacking in Singapore. But the other thing which is I find extremely lacking in Singapore, which makes the question of can Singapore do a Malaysia, at the moment, as what Hisham said, temporary mission impossible, because many Singaporean activists or people who are critical of the government would themselves point the finger at the opposition, at others, for not doing certain things better than they thought it could be done. But very few will point the finger back at themselves to see what they themselves ought to do. And I think that is extremely important. In the case of Malaysians, we saw that during the last election, where individuals make a stand by buying tickets to fly back home. That is an example. I've seen people who are willing to fork out money to support the opposition party because you are fighting against a big juggernaut in UMNO, and now we know how much money was floating around. So that is something which each of us in this room have to ask ourselves, what can we do instead of delegating that responsibility to others. Now, Mr. Chairman, I think I have a few minutes left. Now, there's one area which I find is very important for Singapore activists and even the opposition party to address. Why is the PAP so powerful? The PAP is not funded by the kind of money that is lying around in Najib's flat. It's not those money. The PAP does not have that money. But the PAP is funded by over 1.3 billion of your money through the Residents Association, through the PA. And those community centers and so on, whatever you call it, has been hijacked by Lee Kuan Yew since the day he came to power, and it is structured in the Constitution in such a way that anyone who is involved in the grassroots organization has to be by default a pro-government person. Now, it's strange to me, it's strange to anyone in the Western world that if you have community centers and so on where the local MP, as in Arjunit, could not be the advisors, where forums of this nature could not be held, and because people like Thomas and so on is not deemed as pro-government, then that is something which ought to be challenged. And I believe that, and if one were to start a battle for the control of the PA, then that is the time when the PAP will start crumbling, because they are unable to defend the impossible. And I was just explaining to someone last night that why I got into trouble in 1973 was precisely because we attacked something which was indefensible, and that was the trade union. The trade union were controlled by them. Instead of asking workers to shun away from government-controlled trade union, we encourage them to join. And once you are in, when you turn against them, then I had the frame up against me. And that is how power works in Singapore. And on the question of can Singapore do a Malaysia, my answer is yes, we can. But it is still mission impossible for the time being. Thank you.